Welcome, this is Lenny and this is Jim for Martin County Historical Society's Out of the Past. Today we've got an interview with Richard Bradley about the history of Avery Waytronics here in Fairmont. And before we do that, Jim, you brought some things to look at?
Yeah, I always do. Yeah. Well, today I brought a World War I mess kit. And normally it's latched, but I'm not sure I can get it back open if I latch it, so I left it unlatched.
Sounds good.
TV trick there for you. This belonged to John Campbell, who was a Truman resident at the time. And he ended up going to France in August of 1918, which is about the end of the war. And this was the mess kit that he was assigned and was able to bring it back afterwards. So that's an interesting slice of history.
I hate to say it doesn't look too appetizing.
Yeah, I'm not sure I would have liked to use that myself. Also,
this is a really interesting one.
Yeah, this is a really incredible school days book.
Handmade
by Mary Cecilia Theobald of Sherburne. And, they didn't have annuals in the 20s for most schools. So this is a book that she put together in 1926.
1926, wow.
And you can see she put just all sorts of things in there, ribbons, letters, just her way of commemorating the school year.
Wow,
so,
yeah,
really
interesting.
Yeah, really fun. Some grades and things in there. So, yeah, a very, very cool artifact. One of the things we have just gotten at the museum. So,
well, very interesting. So now, should we take a look at that interview?
Yeah, let's go right on ahead.
Okay.
There's a lot you can learn from Out of the Past.
Today we're at the Pioneer Museum. I'm going to visit with Richard Bradley about the history of one of the most significant industries in Fairmont and Martin County, Waytronics. Richard, first of all, tell us a little bit about yourself, where you came from originally, and what brought you to Minnesota.
Okay, sure, I appreciate that, Lee. My name is, like you said, Rich Bradley, and I was born and raised in the borough of Upper Saddle River, and that's in the county of Bergen County in New Jersey, which is in the northeastern corner of the state, and borders New York. And it's an old county. It was colonized back in the 1600s. And like I said, I was born in 1952. And as a kid growing up in the 50s and 60s, it was really an idyllic area to be growing up. It was pretty rural still at that time. George Washington Bridge had just finished being built, the second stage, the second level. So then it started to develop. When we moved there, and when Dad moved us there in 54, it was probably about 1,800 people. Today, they have about 8,300 people. And what I always thought that was kind of cool about that was the founders of that county, and particularly Upper Saddle River, when they set it up, every homestead had a minimum of an acre and eighth of land. So houses were not stacked on top of one another. And they had wide open space, and it's a hilly area, lots of streams, lots of forests.
So you went to school there, graduated from high school there?
Yeah, I went there. I was there till the end of my junior year is when we moved to Minnesota.
Okay, what brought you here? What brought your family to Minnesota?
Well, what happened was that was all because of Waytronics. It goes into a long detailed thing here about basically what happened. Dad was a stress and strain engineer. He had worked on various projects throughout the 50s and the 60s. And he had a building in his own business called Mechanical Systems in the 1960s. And what he did is he rented part of that building to a business friend. And one day the business friend came to him and said, "Hey, Dick, I've got my boss, Milt Martinson, out in Sheffield, Iowa. He has this plumbing company, and he makes these different devices, and he wants to invent a new product. And so he has an idea. He'd like to make a automatic shut-off valve for the pumps that are down in wells, so they don't burn out when the water gets low in the well." And he asked my father, "Do you think that's something you could do?" And Dad said, "Well, yeah, but I'm trying to run my business, so I'll work on it on my after-hours time." So Dad did, and for about 3 months he worked on it. He developed 3 prototypes, gave them to Dick Gephardt, who was his friend of his. Dick flew out to Sheffield and showed him to Milt Martinson, and they tested them out. They worked like a charm. So Milt says, "Well, what's it going to cost to get these things from Dick Bradley now that he's invented them?" So they got a hold of Dick. They sent Dan Sanderson out, who was the attorney for the firm, to New Jersey. They sat down and talked, and Dan asked him that question. Dad said, "It's not going to cost you a penny." He goes, "What do you mean?" He said, "I'm going to give them to you because of my friendship with Dick."
That was pretty nice.
Yeah, and so, needless to say, Milt was blown away by this generosity. He couldn't believe it. So he and 6 other guys leased an island in Canada on one of the lakes up there, and they used to fish there every summer. So Milt said to Dick Gephardt, he said, "Does Dick like to fish?" And he said, "Oh yeah, Dick loves to fish. That's one of his biggest hobbies." He said, "Do you think he'd be interested in going on a trip up to Canada?" He said, "Sure, let's do that." So they took my father up to Canada, to Lake Atiqua, which is about 150 miles north of International Falls in Canada. And they were fishing, and they were there for a whole week. Well, one day they were on shore lunch. They were at one of the islands, and they were eating there, and Dan turned to my dad and said, "Well, listen, I'm also the attorney for this other company called Archway." And he starts telling my dad about what they make, the grinder mixer and stuff like that.
And Archway, was that in Armstrong,
That's
Iowa
in
at that
Armstrong.
time?
Yes, it was founded and started in Armstrong, and it's still there today.
Sure.
And that was Arthur Luscombe, who was
Sure.
the guy who started that. So anyhow, he tells him about it, and he says Arthur's been trying to develop a scale to go on his grinder mixer, because he realized that if I could have a scale, my farmers could accurately measure the amount of ingredients they put in there to mix.
So they
nutrients.
recognize your dad as somewhat of an entrepreneur from
Well, Dan
plumbing devices to
Yeah.
scales.
Dan did this. Dan reckoned. Dad still had not met Arthur. So he said, "Well, what do you think? You think it's possible?" And Dad, "Well, sure. Anything's possible. I can build a scale for that, but I have to find out what's a grinder mixer. He's never seen one." So Dan said, "Let's go down. Would you go with me down the Archway on the way down home from the trip?" So he took the dad down to Armstrong. They flew into Fairmont and drove down to Armstrong.
And that was his first experience coming to this part of the country.
Yes, it was. It was his first experience. And so he met Arthur. Dan introduced him. They took him around and gave him a plant tour. They went down to the office and explained what they're trying to do. And Dad told him, said, "Yeah, I'm confident I can design a scale for you." And Arthur's response was, "Well, you can do that, but I'm not putting any money into it." And so my father, when he's telling me this story, I said, "I would have been offended." And he said, "No, not at all." I said, "What do you mean?" He says, "Well, this is the first time Arthur ever met me. As far as he was concerned, I was just some
Sure.
young engineer blowing smoke at him."
Yeah,
So I knew that, he said, Dad said, "I knew if I was going to do this, I'd have to prove it to him."
sure.
So he spent the next 3 years developing this scale. It was a lot harder than he had expected. And he was flying back and forth between New Jersey and Armstrong. He'd come into the Fairmont Airport or Mason City, depending on which one. And he'd bring out a new prototype, he'd go there, and it wouldn't work. And this went on and on for, like I said, 3 years. So finally, the last time he flew out, it was his last opportunity. And he said, "I was bankrupt. I had no money. This was the last one. I'd spent all my money on this." So I go in there, I put this thing on one of the grinder mixers, and it doesn't work. And I'm like, he said to me, "That's the first time I was really scared.
Huh.
Because I'm going to have to go home, tell your mother we're bankrupt, have to close the business, nothing's going to work." So he said, I went into one of the engineering rooms, and I closed the door and decided to reassess all my assumptions that he had made when he was working on the design. And one of the things he wanted to test, he said, was the bending moment. And I said, "What do you mean?" He says, "Well, I had designed the axles to be the load cells, and the tire was the anchor point, and the frame was the other anchor point. So the frame would, go this, and the bar would bend and it would weigh. I had assumed that that distance, the moment arm, never changed. So I went out there and I used a 2x4 with some blocks of wood, and I measured it on the inside of the tire, measured on the outside. He says, lo and behold, the stupid readings were different. He says, I realized instantly what the problem was. And so he made this change to the scale, to the weigh bars, had them create a new set, put them on the grinder mixer, and they worked like a charm. Arthur was blown away because he'd seen my father work on this thing for 3 years, and it wasn't successful. And so Dad said, I was just as cool as a cucumber. And I said, well, listen, I'm heading back home. If you guys decide you want me to start making weigh bars for you, just give me a call.
Okay.
Dad said when I got on the plane to go home, I didn't have 2 nickels to rub through. I didn't have any money to produce at all.
Took a big chance then.
Yeah. So he took a big chance. So about 4 or 5 days go by, and Arthur calls him and says, hey, we presented your design to the board of directors. We showed them how great it works. didn't matter what angle it was on the field. It weighed accurately. And they were blown away by this. So the board said, we'd like to pitch to you an idea. We'd like to buy your company and bring you out here to Fairmont or to Midwest, and we'll set up a division called Electronic Scale Division, and you run it, and you can design scales. And Dad said that was a no-brainer. And so they sent Dan Sanderson out, the attorney, to set up the agreement.
Legal.
All right, especially the royalty agreements, because it's his invention.
Sure.
All right. And Dad said that Dan was very generous, and he made sure that my father was well compensated. And so then the deal was they signed the paperwork, and Dad comes home and he announces to us in January or December that we're moving to Minnesota.
And how was that?
I'm like, what are you talking about?
And you weren't done with high school yet.
I was just finishing, I was in the middle of my junior year when he made this announcement. So, and I had grown up with all these kids from kindergarten. So
Sure.
these are all my friends. And I was not a happy camper. My sister, to her credit, was better behaved about that whole thing than I was. And, but I was upset. So he takes Mom and he flies her out here, goes to Mason City because they need to stop by Martinson Manufacturing to see Milt. And then they're going to go from there to Archway in Armstrong. So Dad says, we're in the car driving from Mason City to Armstrong. It's March. Well, you know what March is like, all right? The wind is blowing, there's corn stalks flying across the fields are barren. He says, as we got closer to Armstrong, it got quieter and quieter in the car. And as they started to come into Armstrong, he said, your mother turned to me and she said, Dick, there's no way in God's green earth that I'm going to move to this blankety-blank town in this godforsaken place. And he said, I knew that your mother was that serious, and I was really concerned. So they got to Armstrong, they went to Archway, met some people, and Dad started asking around about other towns, because Armstrong is not going to cut it from the, well, you got to remember, Upper Saddle River is only 20 minutes from the Big Apple. It was a shopper's paradise. You got to be kidding me, you know. Plus, it's rural, but 20 minutes you're in the largest city, one of the largest cities in the world, you know. So she's like, I'm not doing that. So they tell them some different towns, and they happen to mention Fairmont, and they talk about Fairmont's got these lakes, Fairmont's got an airport, and my father said, oh, this is sound promising. So my mother was born and raised in Jacksonville. She was a water baby. She grew up on the beaches. Sure. So water, this is definitely promising. So he brings her up here to Fairmont. They drive around, and she kind of likes the town. She likes the lakes. So they're driving down Shortcush Drive, and Al Zeitz owned this house that's next to the condominiums right now. It's no longer his, but he just put it up for sale. So Dad sees it for sale, so my mother says, if you can buy me that house, Dick, I'll move here. Screech! Car comes a screeching home, he backs up, goes into traffic, knocks on the door, meets Al, they agree, and so Dad goes to First National Bank and he meets Harris Sorensen, who's the president of First National Bank. They introduce themselves, and Harris sits him down and says, I'll get my loan officer, and I think it was Bob Seidel at that time, to write up the paperwork. So they're talking and all that, and Bob brings in the paperwork, Dad signs it, hands it to my mother. My mother starts bawling. She's crying. And she goes, my God, Dick, what have you done? What have you done? But the mortgage on that house was $10,000 higher than the mortgage on the house in New Jersey. And she's like, what is going on here? This is the middle of nowhere. How is this possible? But you know, she forgot about the fact that the house in New Jersey, he built in 1959. This is now 1970. Inflation goes up a lot, you know. So he's like the deer in the headlights. He sees all this. He doesn't know what to do. And Harris sees it. And Harris is cool, calm, and collected. He starts talking to my mother. He talks her down off the cliff, and she signs the paperwork. And Dad says to me, he says, Harris Sorensen from that day forward became my best friend. Well, then Harris and June took him to the golf course and stuff, and they started making friends. You know, and we moved here. We moved here in May or June of 70. I finished my junior year, and we came here. And, you know, my mother and father, they fell in love with this town. My mother said to me, I just cannot believe how open and kind people are in this town. Because it's not that way in New Jersey. It's not that people aren't kind. It's just that they're more reserved. It takes a little more effort to get to know people. But here they're just very outgoing and they speak and they're friendly.
And they lived here the rest of their lives.
Yes, they did. Okay. They lived here the rest of their lives. So basically Fairmont became their town. They love this town. And so that's how we got here. And But the company was still in Armstrong. It was called Electronic Scale Division the first year.
Sure.
And then the second year, the first year they only operated 6 months, and they made $275,000 that first year, which is not bad money back in 1970 for only being in business for 6 months.
Yeah.
And then the next year they had to expand, and they were in a 2,500 square foot outbuilding that Arthur had as part of
In Armstrong.
In Armstrong, yeah. So he said, he came to Arthur and said, I need to build a bigger building. He says, well, build it. Arthur had this unflappable confidence in my father's engineering building. So Dad designed and built a 14,000 square foot building, and that was built next to it, and they moved everything into that. And within 4 years, they were outgrowing that building. I mean, the company was just growing by leaps and bounds.
And you were telling me something interesting about your father being an engineer. He had all this background in engineering in college, but yet he didn't have a degree.
Right, he didn't have a degree. That's exactly. You know, it was interesting. When I went through and doing all the research and as I talked to him about this, one thing I learned is that his work at Republic Aviation and at Bendix Pioneer Aerospace Division were crucial, and they had a huge impact on his psyche as an engineer, young engineer. The projects he worked on became terrific successes. And that just really built his confidence up that he was a good engineer and he knew what he was doing.
Sure.
And it was during that time when he had become interested in the strain gauge, which got him going with the development of the weigh bar down the road. But then when mechanical systems came along, there were 3 other projects that were major impact, and they were all for the New York Port Authority. It was the Lincoln Tunnel, the George Washington Bridge, and the World Trade Center. And they were all stress and strain projects. And the New York Port Authority come in because they were having problems with structural failure. And so he came in with his expertise, and using his strain gauges and his ability to analysis, he was able to identify where they were having these problems, and he could tell them what to do to fix the problems.
Sure.
And they all worked like a charm.
Wow. Yeah.
And so
that's
that
quite
really
wonderful.
built his bona fides as a stress and strain engineer. And at that time, I was told by several people, your dad was recognized as one of the top 2 or 3 stress and strain engineers in the entire world. I said, you're kidding me? He said, no. He said, he was phenomenal. He had unbelievable intelligence about this stuff. And he had an uncanny mechanical ability. He just really enjoyed that stuff.
And it seemed like that background would relate itself to scales.
Yes, because that gave him the technical expertise and knowledge he needed to go and develop this weigh bar that he. And it wasn't originally called a weigh bar; it was called a load cell, and that's interesting because the first year they were there, they went to the Iowa State Fair with a grinder mixer with the new weigh bars and the scale, and he kept referring to it as a load cell. On the way back, one salesman told Dick, he said, "Dick, you need to stop referring to it as a load cell." I says, "Why?" He says, "Because load cells have a horrendous reputation in farming community." I said, "Really?" Dad said, "Really?" He said, "Yeah, because they don't work. They fail prematurely. There's no scales that do a good job. You need to come up with a different name." So I went back and was trying to think about it and came up with the name weigh bar. They patented the name, or trademarked the name, and that's been the name of that weighing device ever since then.
Okay, so from Armstrong, how do we get to Fairmont?
So the company, like I said, was growing like leaps and bounds. And 1976, it just got to be acute. And Dad said it was either we're going to have to build a bigger plant in Armstrong. And he didn't want to do that because he did not want to tie up all of his engineering time with doing that and his engineers and stuff. So he started looking around, and he was good friends with Lou Donnelly, who was the mayor here in Fairmont at that time.
Sure.
And so he went to Lou and he asked him, "Do you guys have any buildings that are decent size that might be available for rent?" And Lou said, "Well, I don't know anything off the top of my head, but talk to the economic development group. They might know." So Dad reached out to them and said, "Yeah, there's a building out west of town. It used to be the Mark IV
Oh, sure, mobile
mobile
homes.
home." Yeah. And so Dad went out and looked, and it's 80,000 square feet. And he liked the building. He reached out to Mark IV Mobile Homes, the owners, and negotiated they pay off another 15% on the note on that building. And then he worked with the board of directors and they bought the building. And then over a period of a weekend, I forget how many semis, it was dozens, moved the entire plant from Armstrong up to Fairmont. And they spent a whole week setting it up in Fairmont. Within a week, they were back up and running in Fairmont. But I remember when I was working for Dad at that time, all right, I had returned home from Minnesota, University of Minnesota. And I was working as a layout draftsman and detail draftsman for him. And me and Jim Moss and a bunch of other people, we went into that building and it was empty, all right? Nothing was there. We looked at the size of this thing and said, my God, we'll never fill this building. And that was summer of 76. By summer of 1980, the company had grown from 78 employees to 411 employees,
Wow.
and they had to add on a 59,000 square foot addition to the building. And they've subsequently made several other additions. So today the building is roughly 282,000 square feet. I mean, it's an enormous building, you know.
And a significant impact on the economy of Fairmont, Martin County, and
Yeah.
southern Minnesota
It-
with all
when-
those jobs.
When he started the company, it was just him and Vince Del Sancho. And Vince Del Sancho was Dad's right-hand man. He hired Vince back in 1954 when he was at Bendix Pioneer Aerospace Division. He needed some engineers to help with the development of service systems. And he liked what he saw with Vince. He hired Vince. Well, they stuck together all the way through to the time when Dad retired here. I mean, that's a pretty impressive working relationship for a couple guys to have. And so they did that, but when they started, like I said, it was 275,000 first. When Dad retired in 1990, they were doing $65 million worth of business in 1990, and they were the second largest scale manufacturing company in the world at that time. Only Toledo, Mettler Toledo was bigger than Waitronix. And today they're still second behind Mettler Toledo, but they're like, you know, I don't even know. It's like $700 to $1 billion to make a year in product. But I could tell you that when you look at what scales, these two scales here, this is the original farm scale, all right? That started it all, and that made it possible for the company to get the capital it needed. The income from the sales of this provided the capital for the company to branch out and develop and design other scales. So, I don't have the exact production figures, but I do know that up until 1981 or 82, they had produced 85,000 of these. And they continued to produce more after that. But each scale had 3 weigh bars. So we're talking basically over 250,000 weigh bars during that first decade, just for the grinder mixer. That doesn't include the platform scales, the industrial scales, all these other scales. It doesn't include all that.
This is very interesting on the background of your father and coming here to Fairmont. But we're going to come back with a part 2, and we want you to tell us more about the products.
Sure, I'd be glad to come back.
What do you think, Jim? That was a pretty interesting interview.
Yeah.
Did you know all that information about Waitronix?
I really had no idea. I mean, I knew it was a big industry here in Martin County, but didn't really know much about it.
You know, he had a lot of information. What do you think? Maybe we should do a part 2.
I think that was quite warranted in this case.
Sounds good.
Yeah. We want to thank Richard for coming on the show. Looking forward to seeing part 2 next time. I want to thank you all at home for watching Martin County Historical Society's Out of the Past.